So how many of you folks were on Tuesday evening? Were any of you on the call on Tuesday?
Four of us were.
Four of you. Okay. Well, you guys have gone quite deep into the area that I was hoping folks would learn from Tuesday in a couple of ways that I think are really impressive. The first is that it's so clear that what you've done is responded to a place-sourced energy, a place-sourced, I'll call it essence, if you will. So this place where the school is located is unlike any other place on the planet. And I would say that's true of any place on the planet. So to make that clear, I used to have a 30-acre farm before I sold it and moved down here. And several years ago, when I was starting to work with that farm, I had a biologist, botanist, probably the best in the country, in my opinion, come and spend a few days with me there, a good friend. He did an inventory of flora and fauna across the entire 30 acres. What we discovered from that was that every square meter of that farm varied in its inventory of flora and fauna species from the adjacent square meter by 30%. That's profound to me. What that told me was that every single place on the planet is entirely unique, in the same way that I think what you're touching upon is that every single human, or for that matter, every single being on the planet is entirely unique and has some contribution that they're being called upon to manifest and contribute to the different systems in which they're nested. So that place is clearly, and has for roughly 30 million years since its inception, been constantly manifesting the role it plays in service to the larger systems in which it's nested and the smaller systems nested within it. In other words, it has a job to do. And what I found really powerful about what you guys have done is you were clearly acknowledging that place source thinking. There was one slide in particular that was talking about xeriscaping and water conservation and the hospitality industry, all things that are entirely unique to that place. So the question that I have for you then, you had mentioned that you had, I'm assuming that was hypothetical, that you had meetings with the students and the teachers and the community, right?
No, we already have our funding and everything.
Good for you.
Yes, hypothetical.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about the funding source, but that's a bottom line discussion for later. So what I'd like to find out is, what is the process you envision for moving this concept, and I'm going to call it a concept, forward, because I have quite a few things to say about the concept. How would you envision moving this forward towards manifestation, realizing it, in other words, making it real? What does that process look like?
I think it starts with the community. I think probably a phrase that's thrown around Las Vegas quite a bit is all in. And I think that the people who are going to be running that school and be working in that school, the one thing that we talked about was being empathetic and understanding what they're truly going through. And what we've outlined are some of the specific community needs, but those needs are going to be constantly changing. So I think the first thing you got to realize is, like, the five of us, we could get a lot done, but we won't be able to get all of it done. We'll need the help from community members, from students themselves. Carrie left us with a good thought that we learn, sometimes as adults, we learn the most from students. So to get it off the ground, I think you're going to need to be able to build that. We're going to be able to build that trust very quickly, but also not hastily, if that makes sense.
So that was one of the really powerful things about what you presented. It was your very first slide, in that your vision is entirely grounded in what the role of that school actually is in service to its community. That was really powerful. And if you're starting from a belief that the system you're seeking to transform is in fact that community and the school is nested within it, I think you're spot on the right track. The issue, though, is, are you doing things to the community, or are you building the community's capacity to continually regenerate their thinking about the community and what their roles are? That's really where I'm headed with this. That's why the process is very different than how we normally think of process. That's why I'm interested in exploring how you guys are thinking about this.
So that's a really good point, and a little bit what I kind of rushed through because I was worried about time in the pattern slide, but those circles, you know, developing a student's learning program with the student, but folding in the family, not just to find out where the deficits are and where the struggles are, but where are the talents and how do we engage that family in the learning process, but also as part of the school, so that there's this ebb and flow. And one of my colleagues, the powerful pieces they brought in is that we would develop an alumni base that is also part of that community as well. So that give and take would be continuous. And we would be following the lead of that younger generation so that when the community changed, the school would change because they were driving that with us.
Well, there was a very clear pattern, Carrie, in your entire presentation that actually was manifest pretty clearly in that nested systems diagram with the concentric circles. And that is, you are holding very strongly, and it's very clear and quite powerful, that it is a co-learning set of experiences. The idea that the teachers are actually learning from their students as co-learners, as opposed to experts leaning down from Parnassus saying it shall be thus, is a new normal. So the new normal that you talked about, I mean, I would love to sit down with you guys for like a day and just really walk through how you're conceiving the process of actually moving this forward. But we don't have time for that. So let's go back then to the new normal. How would you, there was one slide that was actually an architectural image, which was actually pretty amazing. I think it was maybe your third slide. But I don't want to focus on the things. I don't want to focus on the physical objects of what you're producing. It's more, what are the value-adding processes that you're bringing to the table to all stakeholders to achieve this transformation of a new normal? And in order to do that, I'd like to hear some reflections from you guys about what does that image look like? Image for me, the new normal, and spend a minute and see if you can give it a name.
How about the joy of learning?
So what is the value of the joy of learning?
So one of the things that we discussed is that we want our students to love learning. We want them to learn because they enjoy the learning, not because someone told them they had to learn or, you know, placed several textbooks on their desk, right? So we want the students to have projects that are going to, you know, get their own creative juices flowing, get them asking the questions, get them excited about what they're doing. We want it to be driven by them, and we want the students to. So we talked about the students learning from the teachers learning from the students, but we want the students to learn from each other, even older students learning from younger students, right? So we just want it to be so much fun that they don't even realize that it's school, right? So the joy of learning.
So I actually think it's deeper than the joy of learning. That sounds a little bit like, you know, mom and apple pie, right? Of course we all want that. I'm trying to push you to be a little more rigorous in your thinking and quite a bit more specific.
So I would piggyback off of what Sonia said, because what we talked about was not mom and apple pie, but when you say something like the joy of learning, it's what you picture. So it's not a group of sunshiny kids sitting around a table. It's the drive to joy. It's that drive, that inherent drive to change. And, you know, we talked about post-pandemic world and the things we don't want again, the things we want to hold on to. And so driving towards that as human beings, that constant need to seek joy and seek fulfillment, that's what joy means to us, is driving to make change, to see the change and to inspire the change in the community around them.
So there are a couple aspects to that, I think. Well stated. The question I have is, what are the conditions that are necessary to build that will? Which I think is tied deeply to my process question. In fact, I know it is. So what you're talking about is the will to engage a an opening up of non-myelinated neural pathways, process of discovery, right? So this is not easy work. So what are the conditions, the conditions that are necessary for that favorable set of paradigm shifts to happen?
So I would say a couple of things: freedom and connection combined. I think that in this kind of a learning environment, there has to be a freedom of both the teachers and the students, and they have to be connected together. Otherwise, it can't work. And by that, I mean they have to have a relationship. There has to be relationship.
So I think, Amy, that you're spot on there, but I want to dive a little deeper into that, because what you're just talking about is a being state. How is it that we need to be? So it's pretty clear that you guys spent a lot of time on functional stuff, and you also spent quite a bit of time on building will, or this joy of learning. There's a third aspect to any endeavor, and that is, what is the energy field? What is the field we need to generate and regenerate constantly? How do we need to be in order for that to happen? Which is where I'm trying to focus here. And how do you build that? I'll just stop there. Which is, again, tied to the process.
I think going back to your, I don't know if this is answering your question, but the original question about how to rethink the normal,
Good.
to almost take the term learning out of the equation, and it, like, respectful realization. You know, I think.
Wow, that's beautiful, Mark.
I appreciate that. If students are respected, you know, as ones that can contribute to the learning process, they're more likely to realize, you know, their place in society and, you know, their place in the community. And I think, I don't know, I go back to the analogy of you know, the garden, and you said that every square meter is different. I think until you can take care of those different communities, you've got to understand your part in society as a whole first.
You got it. Because every one of those square meters had a role to play in the larger, interconnected, nested set of systems that made that farm alive, which then in turn contributed to the entire watershed or lifeshed in which that farm was located, right? Which you guys, I think, are deeply engaged in. And so I want to come back to the living garden in a minute, but I still want to push a little bit further on those favorable conditions that are necessary, because this, I think, is what's key to the process of how do you actually make this real. So to make this real, it's grounded in your own personal experience. And by the way, I forgot to mention something. There's only 2 rules to us working together. One is, don't believe anything that don't accept anything that I'm saying. Not right until you test it for yourself, right? But also I would suggest don't reject it either until you test it for yourself. So think back on a time in your life that was hugely transformative, some major shift in how you were thinking or how you were being. We've all had several of those. You can probably pinpoint 2 or 3. I mean, I'm talking very serious shifts. If you want to say epiphany is great, but it's not always an epiphany. So what was required for that major shift to happen? What was necessary? What were the conditions necessary? So Amy identified one of them, and that's this idea of freedom and openness, right?
The first thing that came to my mind is courage.
Great.
And for me, discomfort.
Say it again.
Discomfort.
Did you say discomfort?
Yes,
Oh,
I
I'm
did.
so glad you said that, because I thought you said comfort, and I was going to push back really, really hard.
No, nope.
Yeah. So,
it was willpower.
so it's one of the things that it's the one piece of your presentation. Actually, there were 2 pieces of your presentation that I would have loved to hear more about, and that is, what are the disruptions that you are engaging your students in order for them to build the will to want to engage experientially, or Mark, I forget the term you used. It was really quite beautiful. I've already lost it, right?
Respectful realization.
Yeah. I would actually say discerning realizations.
Mhm.
So what are we really working on here, guys? And so how is it that, I mean, everything was so beautiful in your presentation. I kept looking for where are the disruptions that are actually going to make this happen? Where's the destabilizing energy that's required for new growth and regeneration to occur?
I think
And
the pandemic has already provided that.
I was going to say, I think it's
For
naturally
us.
going on right now.
I
say it
think
again?
I think the pandemic has already provided that for us because it's a lot more clear now that what we pretended was working wasn't working. And now we see that there is another way. It may not be the best way, everybody's suddenly home on computers, but that there is another way, right? So I feel like it opened up the floodgates to say, like, let's try something new. Like, let's just try something new.
So Sonia, I'm with you, but just trying something new in and of itself is not very enlightened. It's just, hey, let's try something new, right? So in that set of concentric circles, I'd like to move 2 more nested systems out. COVID is affecting the entire freaking world.
Mm-hmm.
And when we start to move in and in closer and closer, clearly there are very particular effects that COVID is having on your community. I want to go all the way inside of that. There are very particular effects that COVID is having on each one of those individual students. So I want to take it out of the macro for a moment as a thought experiment and see how what you are proposing as a set of curricula whereby the students choose their own path through it, navigating it, where are there in this idea or set of ideas disruptions built into the process that are destabilizing enough for folks not just to like follow the rules? That's what I'm looking for.
And that's the piece where you're folding into the family, you're folding the family in. So however a student defines family, and we see this in our work right now during a pandemic, but there's always disruptions with what's going on in each individual person's life. So Jennifer talked about food being the first concern, not the virus, but feeding people.
Yeah.
Right. And then for me and my students, it's housing. They don't have places to live right now. So basic human needs are the things that are constantly disrupted and interrupted in our community. And that never stops. People lose jobs, gain jobs, don't have housing, don't have food. That stuff is always changing. Families divorcing or, breaking apart or coming together. So that core is always going to define who the student is in the space. And for me, the discomfort is earning trust and having a student say to me, you say you're here for me, prove it. You say this is about me, prove it.
Okay, that's a perfect segue to where I'm really headed with this. And that is, you made a very significant statement. You said educators are empathic leaders. Is empathy enough?
It's the start.
I think it's enough. It depends on how you define it. I think if the thing I think about with empathy, and I'm thinking in terms of like, if we're hiring teachers, like a background check, is that good enough? We don't want a background check. We want to
That's
know
an old
your
normal.
story. We want to know your opinions. We want to, I'm sorry.
I just said that's an old normal. Discard that. So what I'm trying to get you to do is not say what you're not aiming for. In other words, but what is it that you're aiming for?
I think that no, empathy is not enough. You can have a teacher that cares about their student and feels for them and understands where they're coming from and still doesn't really care about changing anything. So I think we need teacher, and maybe it's a blind spot for us because I think we all are the type that will do anything to help our students. So I think we need empathetic teachers who are also willing to learn, willing to grow, willing to change, willing to do whatever it takes for each individual student. So I think empathy alone is not enough. There has to be that will to act for change, that will to change.
So go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say a couple of things. One, what I said, one of the patterns for our teachers or our guides is that the student will eventually outpace the teacher.
Let's hope so.
Right? So the goal is for them to outpace us and not just be empathetic and do the quick fixes, but to help work with the student to find the source. Like our school is about the source of the issues and working with them to be a part of changing the systemic issue that they're facing.
So Kara, I loved your choice of words there for two reasons. There are two things that are emerging out of what we're talking about here. One of the things in our work that we call our work is resourcing. And resourcing is a verb that means helping folks reconnect with their source, which has everything to do with the entire individual unique essence of every single human with whom we encounter, right? So that source piece is really critical. And one way to begin to do that is I'd like to introduce you to a very simple framework that I call, or my mentor, one of my teachers who's in her late 70s, Carol Sanford, calls external considering. So we're trying to build in these students an internal locus of control, right? But related to an internal locus of control, of course, is that every choice we make, every action we take has an impact on others outside of us. Therefore, we also need to take into consideration the external impacts of what we are doing, saying, and how we are behaving, right? So this framework holds that there are 4 levels of external considering. The first one is kindness. And kindness is just, I see you, right? I recognize you. Empathy is probably moving up 1 level, and that is, I see your pain. If we move up 1 more level, then we can talk about compassion. And compassion is, not only do I see your pain, but your pain is also my pain, which is part of the nestedness that you were talking about. But at the highest level is caring, I would suggest, within this framework. And caring is, I am willing to move beyond even worrying about whether you like me or not, because I care so much about your personal development that's all I'm really holding, right? Because I see you as an entirely unique individual who we all need your contribution, which is so tied to the will that you're talking about. And I think is ultimately tied to the process, which is why I wanted to enter this through process. Is this making sense to you guys?
Yep.
So I would like to challenge you to think about trying to envision and in fact concretely think about what would be the next series of steps you would take in the process of trying to make that happen with those set of nested stakeholders. Other than that, I only have one other comment, and it's actually the only negative comment I have to offer, and that is, and I'm sorry, Mark, you were the one that presented this, so it's not about you, but it was, when
It's
you
about
talk
me.
about, huh?
I said it's about me. You can say it.
No. Hey, it's all about you, brother. No, the idea of personal passion and engendering that in teachers, and hopefully you trickle down to the students. Can you please rethink that?
Of course.
Why?
So it has to do with both internal locus of control and external considering, right? If you are hoping that the teacher's passion will build the passion in the students, I think that's probably an inaccurate premise. What you're really trying to do is help students connect with what they, as an individual, unique human, actually care about. And I think that's the core with any living entity that is conscious. So that idea holds true with the students. And then based upon what I saw in your diagram, the next, I think, was family. The next was peers. The next was teachers. The next was, I think, community. I think I'm missing one. But each one of those living entities, I think what you're trying to do is not have a teacher-driven passion that trickles down, because that'll run out of energy. What you're really trying to do is regenerate the caring in each one of those living being entities, all 5 of those nested circles in the living system, which is how I'd like to close this. I just love that you called this a living garden. It is a living garden in, so let me tell you a quick story. In the early 2000s, I was called upon to go to Dubai, and I was there dozens of times because Dubai was, at that time, 15% of the world's cranes were in Dubai. There were 450 high rises under construction, right? Well, to put that in perspective, there are only 350 high rises in Manhattan, right? And we were working on helping them develop a means by which they could do this in some way sustainable. So I landed there the first time, and I think it was August of 2004, maybe a little earlier. And I was there 45 minutes, and I wanted to get the hell out of there. It was like, this place is, there's nothing sustainable happening here. Everything about it is, I didn't think I would survive the 3 days I had to be there. So I was ready to get on the plane and come back. So I called my friend Bill Reed, and Bill said, here, Becker, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go online and look at this 5-minute video called Gardening the Desert, or Greening the Desert. And it was all about a permaculturalist who was able to create, within 18 months, growing figs in the salted, dead soil of the Dead Sea. And it gave me hope. And it was, and basically the way this fellow ended his piece was, we could solve the world's problems with a garden. And when we think about the process of gardening, I think it is, when I asked you to image, I was holding the very image that you guys said right at the beginning. That wasn't a trick question. It was, yeah, this is gardening. This is food for all of the living systems in that particular place. So nice work, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.